Alright, today we're going to go over doing what we call an electronic running compression test. The reason why we call it electronic is we're going to use a lab scope to record our compression readings. So we're going to use our adapter like we would run a typical compression test, but this time we're not going to use the gauge. We also need to use a Schrader valve tool and remove the Schrader valve out of the end of the hose. This hose needs to be clear where air can go both ways. So once you find the correct thread for your spark plug and your spark plug's removed, you want to disable your ignition. This car is relatively easy because it's a coil per plug car, so just unplugging the coil will disable it. If you have a spark plug wire, you can simply just take a jumper wire and insert it up in the spark plug wire, like that, and then ground it, and that will ground your ignition where you're not firing. Also, if possible, if you could get to the fuel injector, unplug that where you're not pumping fuel in the converter and the cylinder. This car, it's really impossible to get to the injector without a lot of work, so we're going to have to leave it plugged up. We just need to not run the car very long with it plugged up. So to do this electronic pressure compression test, we need a pressure transducer. This one right here is a Fluke PV350. That means it can measure up to 350 psi, which should be adequate for our running compression. Our running compression is probably going to be somewhere in the ballpark of from 50 to 150 psi, so we'll be okay. This works off a 9-volt battery, so you have to have a charged up battery, and you need to make sure you cut it off when you get done. Now we're going to measure psi, so I'm going to slide it up to the psi line. And we also need to choose metric or English. PSI is going to be English, so this button here needs to be pressed in. It's got a little illustration right there. The other thing you need to be concerned about is which one of these probes goes in the correct jack on the scope. And the scope right here, our black little test lead is for ground, and then channel 1 is going to be the yellow. So on my pressure transducer, I need the voltage to be in the yellow and the comm in the black. So when I put it in there, it's actually going to be backwards. I can't get to my switch anymore, so I need to get my switch set up before I put it in. Now on the back of this right here, it tells us what our conversion factor is. This piece right here will actually turn the pressure that's read on this hose into millivolts. And the output of this one is 1 millivolt per unit. That means 1 millivolt will be equal to 1 psi. So whenever we set up our scope, we need to have it on a millivolt scale. So that gets the unit plugged in here. So I'm going to plug it back in here where we have a big screen. All right, and we have a quick connect fitting here that goes straight onto our compression gauge. We'll snap it on like that. If you can get this screen over here. I'm going to choose the scope multimeter. I'm going to choose lab scope. I'm going to choose 4-channel scope. I'm going to go to setup. I'm going to go to traces, and being that I went in at channel 1, that's the same thing as trace 1 on this particular scope. So right now my total screen is for 100 millivolts. That would equal 100 psi. So that may be close enough. We may adjust it whenever we get it up there. We want our waveform to fill up as much of the screen as possible. So I'm going to leave that at 100 millivolts. I'm going to turn on the filter just to make it clean. So everything looks good there, so I'm going to exit. The other thing we have to be worried about is our time, or what Snap-on calls the sweep. Now you can get your waveform up there and then adjust that. So right now it's on 200 milliseconds. Usually 100 to 200 milliseconds is just about right. So we'll leave it at 200 milliseconds. And here's our trigger. We're going to have to use our trigger to stabilize our waveform. So let's stop the video and we're going to get the car running.